I would like to call upon stage Mr. Bejoy Pankajakshan from Mavenir. Let's welcome him on the stage, ladies and gentlemen. And the clicker, the middle one.
So good afternoon, everybody. Before we start the presentation, first of all, I want to thank the organization for allowing me the opportunity to present here today. Before we get into the presentation that's titled The Evolving Role of OEMs in Digital Revolution, I want to take a minute to talk about digital revolution itself. So for the folks who are not familiar with what digital revolution means, it's defined as an ongoing process of social, economic, and political changes that's primarily brought about by digital technology, which can include computers and the internet. And we've gone through a few phases of this digital evolution so far. Phase one was sort of personal computing and data processing. Then you went into network computing. And right now we are in the fourth phase of what's called cloud computing. And there's been a lot of discussion so far on the impact of this digital revolution on manufacturing, particularly in the last century as well. So today we'll talk about its impact on OEMs, and especially the relationship that these OEMs have with the telco service providers or the communication service providers. As we look at the mobile cellular technology, we've gone through a few generations, starting from 2G to 5G. So 2G was first built. It was built for voice and for texting. So we had a few dominant players in the market at that time, Nortel Networks in the late 1990s. With 3G came about advanced multimedia services. You could start sending MMS at this stage. But also with it came a few new players in the market, primarily the ZTEs and Huawei's came into the market. Competition increased and you had some players who were eliminated. For example, Nortel as an OEM doesn't exist anymore. 4G then brought about voice over IP. It brought much richer communication suite. And you had a few entrants who were purely software-based come into the market. Mavenir was one vendor who came into this market in 2005 as a result of this transition from 3G to 4G. Again, consolidation happened, competition increased. You had vendor consolidation, for example, ALU and Nokia acquisition happened. Up until this point, we were primarily built to support the billions of people and their connections. So now when we move to 5G, we're moving towards a different kind of network, a network that needs to support different service requirements. So we're thinking about a paradigm shift essentially in terms of technology. You're looking at SDN and FV. There's a lot of talk in the last few days about the use of open source software. We will see the monopoly on the radio being broken in terms of how the radio itself is deployed. We'll have open RAN based solutions. The use of AI, blockchain, cloud automation, these are all themes that you heard throughout the conference over the last couple of days. So we'll continue to see that, and the result of that is going to be that as you serve these trillions of things and connections, you're going to have new players, the non-traditional telco players, start to address and play a bigger role in this market. And of course, inevitable would be the absence of few players, the consolidation, elimination due to competition. Now, how can OEMs themselves prepare for this digital transformation? So let's start by looking at the trends. The first is the explosion of data traffic. I'm sure for the crowd here in India, this is no surprise. We now are at 9.8 gigabyte per month. Over the last 3 years, I guess we've doubled and tripled our numbers and expected to grow again 7x times over the next 5 years. Increase in connected devices. We should continue to see the exponential growth in the number of connected devices, particularly in metropolitan areas. We talked about the 4 waves of digital revolution, with cloud computing being the current phase. So we'll continue to see the impact of that. And as a result, you'll have the need for big data analytics, and along with it comes security as well. So there's still a lot of opportunities for OEMs as well as for the telco communication service providers. It all depends upon how you use that opportunity. Starting with extracting value out of your existing telco assets. So beginning with, the OEMs need to prepare for a network transformation. The network transformation, as was talked about in the previous presentation, is about simplifying the network making them network more cloud native, making it open. So OEMs from a software perspective need to be preparing to have a migration of capabilities that supports web scale deployment model. Operators for their part, the network again, the radio, as I mentioned earlier, the most expensive part of the network, that monopoly there is going to be broken in terms of solutions like Open RAN. Operators still have thousands, or I'd say so many number of cell sites in comparison to what the global infrastructure public cloud providers have. Take, for example, Airtel, Vodafone, Jio. You would have the number of local data centers that these operators have, which means reach into the end user, dwarfs the number of availability zones that Amazon, as an example, has globally. Which means that new business models can emerge, new opportunities like multi-access edge computing that was mentioned by Zati in the previous presentation. So at the end of the day, this results in new ecosystems being set up, new revenue streams also, and new opportunities both for OEMs as well as for the communication service providers. If we look at the MNO infrastructure, today we are around 8 billion subscribers worldwide. And if you look at the number of connections, which includes IoT devices, we're probably around 20 plus billion of connections, and that's going to continue to increase. But the bottom line of this chart shows the Capex spend that the operators have to make in order to sustain the capability to continue to support this ever-increasing growth of data traffic. The problem there is the Capex ROI, particularly in the India market, is pretty low. If you look at the Capex to revenue ratio, it's high for the Indian market, driven by multiple factors, starting with some of the challenges which were addressed earlier as well, not in today's presentation, but in yesterday's panel discussions and others, was the spectrum challenge in India. The cost per megahertz here is almost twice that of other developed countries. You have the high debt ratio of the carriers here. Take Vodafone idea as an example. You have close to 29x in debt to EBITDA ratio, which is pretty high, so you leverage very badly. On top of it, you have the tax burden. It's a highly competitive market, ARPU numbers being the lowest in the country. So all of this results in, at the end of the day, the operator needs to be able to address new ways in which they can generate revenue and get better ROI out of their Capex investment. I've seen numbers from different analyst reports, but anyway, the number range that I've seen is north of 50 billion for the operator community in India to be able to launch 5G, which is a huge number if you have to consider the amount of debt that they have already. Now going down to the digital transformation over the last 10 years, the last 8 years if we look at it, counting 2010 as a start, what this chart is showing is, if you look at the numbers between 2010 and 2018, the tier 1 operators or the tier 2 operators, for the most part, the way they've grown their revenue is either through organic growth, which is in underserved markets, which can be Africa, can be China, it can be other mass market where the revenue opportunity is low. The alternative is you have operators who have had M&A, mergers and acquisitions, as a way to organically grow. But if you look at the other OEMs who have played in this space, it's been the non-telco players, the Apples, the Amazons, the Googles, who have reaped the benefit of this digital transformation. And those are the ones who have actually grown their market. And you see a lot of push from operators today. You hear about terms like NFV OpenStack, you hear web scale deployment models, and the idea here is that operators want to move towards a web scale model to eventually use the tools that are available in the open source, which allows them to, at the end of the day, reduce the OpEx and get on par with the other web scale players. But if you look at how the revenue is split today for operators between telco and non-telco services, you could see for the most part operators don't have much revenue coming out of non-telco services. And some of the stats I've seen, if they have to grow their revenue overall by 1% on a year-over-year basis, you have to grow your non-telco services at close to 10% for any offsetting any 1% decline on their traditional telco services. It's a huge challenge for them, especially for these operators who have 80-20, less than 80-20 mix in their telco to non-telco service ratio. So moving on, the transition to web scale. So the first wave of NFV OpenStack deployments happened in the telco prem, what we call as the private cloud deployments. But with the transition to web scale, for various reasons, 5G being the driver, virtualization being the driver, when you look at that market, you're now going into a multi-cloud deployment model. It could be public clouds, it could be hybrid clouds, it could be the edge cloud for multi-access edge computing kind of use cases. But the result of this for OEMs is that the applications now needs to be ported to work in this multi-cloud environment. So for software-only players, this is not much of a challenge because the software is already architected in a way which allows them to move into this multi-cloud environment. But for the traditional NEPs who've had hardware-based solutions, it's going to be a much bigger challenge, a larger R&D effort to do this transition. The end result is that you have a lot more opportunities in 5G. You could do things like AI, immersive reality. You could do edge clouds to actually improve on the user experience. And at the end of the day, automation is going to drive lowering the cost for the operator. You also see public cloud providers, Amazon's and Azure and Google, Oracle, these sort of big players in the public cloud today change their business model to start working with the telco providers. One good example, if you haven't heard, is AWS Outpost. You see Amazon now starting to work with the telco players to be able to host telco workloads on the data centers that are owned by the operators. That changes the business paradigm both for operators as well as for the public cloud providers. We talked about IoT being a big driver in terms of overall growth for the market. The other areas that we discussed were cloud, automation, blockchain. And at the end of the day, if you look at the overall result, the expectation is for a growth of close to 36% in revenue, driven by multiple factors, either service revenue, network services revenue, and covering different verticals. It can be healthcare, automotive, industrials. And again, I'm not going to spend time on use cases. We had multiple speakers talk about use cases. So this is an aggregation of different use cases which will be implemented, and the end result of this is this aggregate growth. Another key area is going to be how the radio market is disrupted. So yesterday, Matthew, and I don't know how many of you were here in the panel discussion yesterday, but one of the key factors which Gio presented was how the radio market would be opened using Open RAN. Mavenir was one of the earlier pioneers in Open RAN technology. And for us, being in the space is important because that's where 90% of the operator spend is. And if you could disrupt that market, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of being able to innovate in the space. You hear about app stores for the application layer and the core for the packet core side, but you don't hear about it on the radio side. And this Open RAN technology now allows you to have that capability. The results that I show here are from GSMA. The results are not public yet, but you could see on here around 68% of operators globally are looking at O-RAN-based solutions, Open RAN-based solutions in the near future. Cost driver is, of course, a driver for them, but it's not the only driver. There's innovation possibilities. There's capability for third parties to innovate as a result of this Open RAN solution. And the overall TCO comes from being able to run on general purpose software. It's either Capex driven or OpEx driven capabilities. We talked yesterday about a hyper-connected world, and one of the themes of the conference is being immersive, intelligent, and inventive. To get to that hyper-connected experience, you actually need an end-to-end coordinated architecture that is agile and can fit to this sort of a flexible framework. So from an OEM perspective, what needs to happen is you need to evolve from a fit-for-purpose architecture to fit for growth. And that means you need to be modular, multi-tenant, and the capability for that, if you're driving the customer experience as the end driver, if at the end of the day, your goal is to have a better customer experience, this drives from a product model towards a services model. And what drives that are new business requirements as well, whether in terms of multi-level customer experience or in terms of capabilities such as network as a service. A good example was, again, Vodafone Idea announcement from earlier this week at IMC, where they're looking at leveraging their network for network as a service. Other capabilities, we talked earlier about CSPs, or telco service providers, moving from, or being challenged today in terms of their revenue, their high Capex. And here what I'm talking about is how do these telco service providers, or communication service providers, transition into what you call as a digital service provider. And underlying this strategy is the capability to launch new services much faster. So if they have to do that, you need to go through a digital transformation that entails the entire organization. And when I talk about the organization, it's not just the technical capability, it's culture, it's what role they play in the overall ecosystem. So once that transformation happens, which is already in way, you get into a network model where you could launch new services such as network as a service. And the opportunity that's shown here is around 50 billion by 2025. And that's a global number, but the opportunity again exists not just as a global market, it exists in all markets. Governments around the world are opening up bands. It's licensed bands, unlicensed, shared spectrum. And the end result of that is the OEMs who play in this space, or the industrial users who want to launch networks and have the capability, the same set of requirements around coverage, security for these mission critical applications which are important for Industry 4.0, or the fourth wave of industrial revolution. It's important to have built in these capabilities into their roadmap or into their product capabilities. Earlier generations of technology before 5G had this as an add-on. So private networks were as an add-on to public cellular networks. But now this is directly addressed in 5G. And what that allows is OEMs, particularly OEMs like the chipset makers or the car manufacturers or the air and defense enterprises, to actually now launch their own private networks. We started off the discussion about how manufacturing and how digital transformation was impacting manufacturing, especially in the last century. But as we look at now in 5G, and we talk about 5G and its impact on different verticals, the digital transformation will continue to have an impact on manufacturing. And this time, in terms of what's called AIoT, or Artificial Intelligence of Things. This is an estimate from Gartner, who's saying by 2025, enterprise IoTs will have some form of AI as a component in the overall solution. And this is in comparison to where we are today, which is less than 10%. So OEMs who can actually adapt their solutions to work in this environment should see a huge opportunity to drive revenue for themselves, as well as to the operator, because the operator has additional capabilities. In this particular case, I'm talking about predictive analytics, so analytics as a service. And the end result is any organization that can apply real-time data to AI ends up generating a substantial increase in their business revenue. In this case, projections of up to 35% increase in profitability over the next 5 to 6 years. Finally, collaboration in the industry is going to drive new roles to OEMs. So 3 main areas that I've highlighted here. The first one being in terms of players who are in the white box switching or general purpose hardware who could work on merchant silicon. You have companies like Intel, Xilinx, and others who are now producing products which would help accelerate performance, so in forms of FPGAs or smart NICs. The second set of players are the ones on the right-hand corner, who are the traditional consultancy companies or the traditional system integrators who could work with the OEMs, assist them in the business model in terms of services like assets as a service. And the third category are the operator players who could transition into network as a service, or OEMs themselves who could play as the bigger guy supporting the smaller OEMs. So this sort of transformation, we talked about how OEMs could transition in this journey of 5G, and I didn't want to spend again time on the 5G use cases, but I want to cover the spectrum of how OEMs could impact different areas of the business, different verticals, different enterprises, as well as the communication service providers who are their primary customers today. One thing that encourages me very much is what's happening with the participation of the India government. You're seeing initiatives such as Digital India, you're seeing initiatives such as smart villages. So all of this should help us realize this. So whether it's the use case of smart irrigation, I come to India once every 6 months or so, and every time I've come, what struck me is how hard it is for commute in our major cities. We talk about 5G, and one of the major areas that they talk about is smart transportation. If this sort of service actually kicks off, you could see how efficient a public smart transportation could reduce the wait time for riders. You could optimize the inventory of vehicles that run on the roads. Cars today, where everyone is driving their own cars, you could actually platoon in groups, which gives us a capability to increase the overall road vehicle capacity. So when we talk about these use cases, don't think about it as too far out. It's all realizable with the right technology focus and the right ecosystem. And players like us and other OEMs who work in this space, working with the government, should help us reach there. Thank you.